Welcome to our tech policy webinar organized by the San Francisco Bay Area chapter of the Internet Society. And so thank you so much for attending. And we've got a really exciting presentation for you today. Dr. Laura DeNardis is here to talk to us about the Internet in everything, freedom and security in a world with no off switch. Dr. DeNardis is at American University, where she is the interim dean of the School of Communication and the faculty director of the Internet Governance Lab. She's written a number of books, 7 books actually, and the one that we're going to talk about today, The Internet in Everything, this one was named by the Financial Times Best Technology Books of 2020. So this is a really fabulous discussion and some important research and scholarship that she's done on these issues where internet governance and cybersecurity sort of meet together. Okay, well, so how we're going to run this today is Laura is going to give a presentation for about the first, say, 35, 40 minutes, roughly, somewhere in there. And then we're going to take questions from our attendees. And so the way that you can ask a question is to use the Q&A feature on this Zoom webinar. And send your questions in that way. And then we will send them all throughout the course of the presentation, and then we can collect them. And then we will have Laura answer those questions there towards the end for the last, say, 15 minutes or so. So that is how we're going to run the webinar. And without any further ado, let me just turn it over to Laura to give her presentation. Thank you. And thank you so much for coming, Laura. This is such a treat for us.
It's my pleasure. Thank you for having me. Thanks for the invitation, Robin. And hi, everyone. It's wonderful to join you wherever you are in the world this afternoon, this evening, this morning, to discuss my latest book, The Internet and Everything, Freedom and Security in a World with No Off Switch, which was published last year by Yale University Press. So I call it my pandemic book. And at the end of the presentation, I will show you a picture of what the pre-pandemic book tour was like, and then what exemplifies the post-pandemic tour to try to make you smile. But it's really wonderful to be able to use Zoom webinar. And I actually have been discussing the book far more than I usually do, just because of not having the limitations of getting on a plane. So that's the Internet and everything. And that's what the Internet Society is all about. And I think we never before, even those of us who have been involved in internet design and governance for years have never really appreciated the internet the way that we do now, and the ability to work, even though so many people are left behind and, there's so much work to be done. I'm not really imagining the pandemic without the internet. So as a member of the DC chapter of the Internet Society, I share a lot of the values that I know you hold. But even before completing my last major book, which was called The Global War for Internet Governance, a question loomed large in my mind and just really, really nagged me. And it was that book was about how is the internet governed from a technology standpoint and infrastructure governance. But the question was, how will the Internet of Things complicate this? What will that mean for democracy, for society, national security, and for the internet itself? I saw the entire world, and I still do, discussing content-related issues over the internet, whether hate speech or terrorism, disinformation. All of these things are so important. But I was seeing, as I was traveling the world with my research, I was a member of the Global Commission on Internet Governance. I've involved in many different things. I felt like the bigger issue to society would be the IoT. And I wanted to write a book about that. What does that mean for cyber governance? I decided to open the book with a question that seems really retrospectively chilling in light of the pandemic that is keeping us all apart today. So what would the internet be doing if humans suddenly left the earth? Well, a lot would still be happening. In DC and San Francisco and Beijing, there still would be video cameras constantly streaming video. Self-driving trucks would be moving material around a mine in Australia. There'd be Russian social media bots circulating political propaganda. There'd be thermostats in homes that are regulating climates. Robots would be moving merchandise around Amazon fulfillment centers. What else would happen? Environmental sensors would continue to gauge air pollution levels. Bank accounts would make mortgage payments. Servers would mine Bitcoin. That would have environmental impacts. Until electricity stops flowing, cyberspace lives. So I wrote that as the opening paragraph just to try to capture how far digital systems have leapt from human-facing display screens into the physical world of material objects. So the thesis of the book related to that is that the internet is no longer a communication system, or it's no longer merely a communication system connecting people and information and access to knowledge. It is a control network in which more things than people are connected, and in which control over that entire infrastructure is a proxy for political power all around the world. The digital world, we often thought about the online world and the offline world. These two can no longer be separated. I used to be able to enter the internet through a screen, and now I enter the internet through objects. You can't separate the physical and the screen-based internet anymore. They're completely intertwined. Now, as the technology makes this leap from two-dimensional space, the screen, into three-dimensional space, digital policy also needs to make that leap. So that's lagging a little bit behind. Now, of course, the Internet Society knows what I'm talking about. I'm talking about the IoT. This is really just the fact that more things than people are connected, billions upon billions of objects. They exist simultaneously in the physical world and the cyber world. So you see just a refrigerator. It's now even an outdated smart refrigerator, but that can be used for many different things that are related to the refrigerator. But it can also be used by a grounded child to send a text message to circumvent being grounded. I mean, these are cyber devices. They're also physical devices. In fact, it's more difficult to jump onto Amazon and try to buy an object that doesn't have some kind of digital, cyber embedded capability than one that doesn't. So this is generally called the Internet of Things. Some people, especially when referring to the industrial Internet of Things, use the word cyber physical systems. It also includes connected clothing, wearables, things that are in and on the flesh. So that's the Internet of self. Where people have insulin devices that are embedded, that cardiac appliances, Fitbits. This is the body. The body is now part of this digital object space. I've been doing internet governance. Robin and I have traveled in a lot of the same circles over the years, and it's really remarkable how the internet has made that move from the two-dimensional screen-based world. Obviously there is a physical embodiment of the internet. There always has been buildings you can go into, but the way we experience it now is through objects. And this is a major transformation. The Internet of Things, industrial Internet of Things, smart city. So that the people who are involved in the Internet Society certainly understand this. I realized how much this connects to areas outside of internet governance when I went to a farm in Culpeper, Virginia, which is not far from my home in Washington, D.C., to see the robotic milking machines where cows would enter a stanchion and it's voluntary. They walk into it, they get milked. It's a robot that milks them. And then the data is collected, analyzed, sent probably through extremely proprietary technologies to a system that then is analyzed, it's processed, and then over the public internet, it goes to the farmer's smartphone. And so you could actually see the apps. And it made me realize that now a cyber security attack is no longer just about stealing my personal data. It's about disrupting our food supply. So you really can see, for me, it was a physical, I could touch the cows, I could, just take in the entire farm experience, but then I was realizing how embedded the internet is in everything. So this is something that's been happening for a very long time. History is so important. This really has been happening for a while. Think about 3 stories alone. Just really, really quick stories that go back a long time. You might remember when former US Vice President Dick Cheney and his cardiologist disclosed in a television interview that the doctor had, in 2007, ordered the disabling of a wireless feature in his implanted defibrillator in an abundance of caution around fears that a terrorist could assassinate him by wirelessly hacking into a pacemaker. This seemed like a remote possibility until fast forward many years, more than a decade later, the FDA issued a safety warning about vulnerabilities in radio frequency enabled implantable cardiac devices. That's a pacemaker. So that was a story that goes back a little bit, that shows that connection, that it hints at the social consequences of this transformation and the political ones. I like to use Stuxnet as an example because that is now 11 years ago. It's also over a decade ago, and that was the worm targeting Iranian nuclear control systems. That was a very different circumstance than some of what we think about as cybersecurity attacks on the IoT, but it does it very much exemplifies the political entanglements between digital systems and the material world. Now, since then, there have been countless politically motivated attacks on critical infrastructure, including Russian attacks, especially on Ukrainian power systems. And then the third quick historical example, it has to be the Mirai botnet. So that probably jumped to your mind too. This was at least at the time, as far as I know, the largest botnet attack in history, which hijacked home IoT devices like security cameras and digital video recorders to carry out a DDoS attack, a denial of service attack that took down major popular media sites like Netflix and Twitter and Reddit. It was even more interesting than that because it did it by taking down part of the domain name system. So you don't have to, that's another story in internet governance that I'd love to talk about, but that's another interesting aspect of it. But what it does is it just reminds us that the IoT is not only a potential target, but it is also a potential attack vector from which to disrupt communication. So that's pretty consequential. But speaking of consequences, what does this all mean we talk a lot about disinformation and fake news and hate speech and the stability of our financial systems, all incredibly important, the nature of truth. But what the consequences of this move, this leap of the internet into the material world, this transformation of the internet from a communication network to a control network is, or let's say it may be even more consequential than the shift from an industrial society to a digital information society. The potential for human advancement and economic growth, what we like to call in and around the internet society, human flourishing, the kinds of benefits that we get from the internet. This is staggering, when you think about what can happen, but it does create new challenges that accompany that. Labor issues alone are an enormous consideration. Cyber-connected, autonomous objects, especially like self-driving trucks and connected robots. So some of these use a combination of proprietary technologies, but they're connected to the public internet in some way. They're cyber and they're physical. And the move from human involvement in these jobs to just complete autonomy with cyber embedded objects, it's subsuming entire labor categories. It's already doing that. Politicians are talking about that, they're anticipating it. And that will be a reality in my lifetime, where we have self-driving cars on a regular basis around us. privacy is transformed possibly to an even greater extent, will there be any domain of human existence that remains private when I can't just turn a laptop off anymore? I can make choices as a consumer, I can make choices as a scholar, I can make choices as a technologist, but I still have, I'm still connected, and I can't turn it off with the screen. Will there be any domain of human existence that remains private when now surveillance is no longer about discovering the contents of an email, but about listening to everything that we do in our homes, our bedrooms, our cars, our work? The massive, intimate data collection means that government surveillance becomes potentially much more invasive and much more pervasive. And it also creates a very, very strong connection between privacy and discriminatory practices and bias. With the data from the IoT feeding into everything from insurance eligibility to employment decisions, credit ratings, evidence gathering, political communication targeting. The list goes on and on and on. It's very invasive. Excuse me. Very closely related to that, and if you talk to anybody who investigates domestic violence cases, they already know that the IoT is now intertwined with, on a regular basis, with domestic violence and harassment in homes. So it's a way for a partner who has left the home to harass a partner that remains in the home, either with surveillance cameras or by locking doors, by turning lights on and off. This is a transformation of privacy that is very powerful and very alarming. Now, one complication to this, because we might just naturally think, okay, well, you just protect privacy, you limit the data collection. Well, one complication in this world is that the massive data collection, the constant feedback loop is necessary for the very operation of the system. That is true whether you're talking about a weather sensor to detect climate change patterns, or a surveillance camera that is detecting motion, or anything else. That is a complication. You can't just say, well, we'll limit the data collection. You can limit what is done with the data and many other things. So the principle of data minimization still can be a critical check on privacy violations, on data breaches, because you can bound the data based on that operational performance rather than sharing it on the back end. So imagine a world in which the IoT data that's collected is then combined with Facebook data and then given to the third party and processed, and it's it's really, really quite amazing. I mean, I've been an open standards advocate my entire life. Robin knows that, so has she. And in this case, we don't want a toaster connected to a nuclear reactor, but we may also not want things that are in our private home domain connected to things that we do in the screen-based internet and in workplaces. So the privacy dilemma is a big one. How do you do notice and consent with this? How do you do consent with no screens? How do you do consent when you get wrapped up in the objects around you that you may not have a direct financial consumer arrangement with? They may belong to somebody else. So this principle that we have always advocated for anyone concerned about privacy, we give notice of what's collected and someone has choice. You can argue that that choice has never been that meaningful, and that a lot of people, if you're in a hurry, you just check, I agree. But at least there was some option for that. How do you do consent with no screens? So privacy is utterly transformed. Now, it may be a little bit less obvious what this has to do with democracy and things like disinformation. What is the connection between disinformation and the IoT? I intentionally stated in the beginning that there's a lot of attention to disinformation and content-related patterns. Well, I've written and spoken a lot about the risk of disrupting elections via the IoT. And indeed, the next wave of election interference could come through the IoT, the Internet of Things, rather than via hacking of voter rolls or hacking into emails of the DNC or computational propaganda. And that kind of election interference could be far more potent. So, just think about it. What, if we were sitting around a table, I would just love to hear, what you think. How could disinformation connect to the IoT? Well, it certainly can heighten the effect of information manipulation. So fake news and things like phishing schemes that are designed to deceive people are more effective when they have a whiff of truth to them. The data that's collected from cyber embedded objects, whether cars, homes, medical devices, any kind of object, that can make those phishing schemes seem much more believable. So that's one connection. A second connection is that instead of interfering with content or probing voter rolls, or trying to break into even the apparatus of voting, it would be much, much more effective to just stop people from voting by distracting them, by disrupting traffic and energy systems, by creating false weather forecasts, by altering the sensor, by creating local emergencies that divert attention on election day. And you do it in a swing district, you do it in a district that you target. So a data scientist could easily, you don't need a data scientist to figure out where the swing districts are. Actually, it's razor thin in many cases. And so if you disrupt if you disrupt voting through the IoT, that really would be a concern. And then third, what's the connection between disinformation and the IoT? Well, and democracy and the IoT, this one now really, really speaks to democracy. You can just hijack the IoT to carry out DDoS attacks on political campaign websites, on major media sites. All of these things have happened. They just haven't been put together quite in that way of making the connection to how it could interrupt democracy. So the IoT can be an ex ante source of disinformation by manipulating environmental sensors. What this means, what is the implication for cybersecurity here? This means that cybersecurity is not only about the security of the digital system. It means that it's also the security of that interface between the physical real world signal and whether it's rotation, it could be temperature, it could be pressure, it could be any kind of movement. And then you manipulate the physical world at that point of transduction from one kind of physical signal into the digital signal, and then sense it with the digital sensor. You could encrypt it. You could do error correction and checking, and you've legitimized it in a way through technology that makes the receiver of that information think, well, it's definitely right. It's encrypted, it's safe. So that makes the real world part of the cybersecurity world and the domain of attacks. So this is a bit of a shift. So you can't, cybersecurity doesn't just involve computer science expertise, engineering expertise, mechanical engineering, material science, all other kinds of real world technology expertise areas are just as important. So that's very interesting to me as someone who studies cybersecurity governance. And just a little bit more on that. So think about cybersecurity alone. Cybersecurity is already part of cyber war. We know that the nature of cyber war merges with real world war in many different ways. This just heightens that. The implications of cybersecurity problems rise dramatically in other areas as well, because I don't think I'm overstating it when I say that a cybersecurity breach is in this internet and everything is no longer about losing access to communication, things you can access through a screen, but about losing the ability to access medical care or food supply or transportation. So this is pretty this is pretty major. Now, at the same time as the consequences rise, I put an Internet Society quote in here. The truth is that cybersecurity is just not that high in the IoT. There's not enough being done to strengthen the security and the privacy of consumer IoT. So just about every authority, cybersecurity researchers, those of us who studied outages, um, internet governance, experts, policymakers, everybody agrees that the IoT is not, that there's an urgent problem here. It's not there yet. So I wrote this book because I believe there is not adequate policy attention to this cyber physical transformation, considering the political stakes of the transformation. And in the book, I do go through quite a few recommendations for privacy, for interoperability, for security, and make some recommendations. And one thing I hope I do, and I've tried to do in my other books as well, is to open up the black box of technology, to try to explain what the political implications are of the technology and the governance of that technology, and then to try to translate how that technology works can translate into what's feasible in policy. You can't always do everything that you want to make things more secure because of limitations in the technological environment. So I'm a technology and science and technology studies scholar. So I believe that there's politics in the design of technology, and I have an engineering background, and I look at the design of technology and try to figure out what those interfaces are and what the policy implications are. But if you believe, like I do, that arrangements of technology are also arrangements of power, then you can see the kinds of limitations and opportunities that arise. For example, a lot of IoT devices are what are called constrained architectures. They're small devices that may have memory limitations, they may have processing limitations. So you can't just say, let's add encryption into the mix in that kind of environment. So it's a very difficult area. But my book does recommend an entire constellation of approaches that are multi-stakeholder, that are necessary to address the very real security and privacy problems, whether security by design, device upgradability, lifecycle management, maximum transparency and disclosure. I talk a lot about corporate governance in this area. I do regular cybersecurity trainings for people who are on boards in corporations, and they really get what the risk is in offering. It's very difficult to find a company that doesn't use the IoT within their own institution or sell products that are embedded with cyber components. So they understand the risks. They understand the need to do things like have insurance structures. And by the time you go through those hoops, you've gotten somewhat far down the line in securing the IoT. But there's a whole other area outside of securing the IoT that is relevant here. So, as an internet governance scholar, I've long followed the debates around things like cyber offense versus cyber defense. And part of that has been the trend around the world to stockpile knowledge of cyber vulnerabilities. It used to always be the case, years ago, that when someone found a bug in technology, they would contact the manufacturer and it would be patched. Well, now in the United States and in countries around the world, there's a calculus about if the government locates a vulnerability in software, they would say, well, maybe we should retain this and not disclose it so that they would have a way to do cyber offense. So if you think about the stakes of the Internet of Things, and if you believe some of the social privacy, security, just the right to not be killed over the IoT, if you really believe that this is consequential, then we have to pull back on some of those things and go back to cyber defense a bit. So shift the needle a little bit back into cyber defense rather than in cyber offense. So that's a really tricky thing. And since my book was published, there was a US IoT Cybersecurity Improvement Act. California has done some things around the IoT. And there are things, especially around procurement policies, so that governments would buy technologies that are IoT related, that meet certain minimum standards. So there are many, many different things that can be done. Now, here's something that's really interesting to me. That just, this is kind of an important thought to throw out to this crowd. And it's really the question of, what does the IoT do to internet governance? To the way that we have always thought about multi-stakeholder internet governance. As much as we can criticize that, well, the IoT challenges norms of global internet governance in many, many different ways. If technology is not fixed, it wouldn't be fair for me to say that internet governance is fixed. So the administration of technologies it's not fixed any more than the device transformations are fixed. So everything is changing all the time. Now, in this area, if you think about the IoT and how it's embedded in all companies, you have to say, what is a tech company? So what is a tech company? The stock market went up a lot today. Google, Apple, Facebook, Amazon, Microsoft, GAFAM, the GAFAM or the FANG, however you want to think about it. And these are the companies that we traditionally think of as tech companies. But in this domain, a retail company, an insurance company, an industrial company, a manufacturer, an agriculture products manufacturer, a farm, these are all now tech companies. They all gather data about people. They all require strong cybersecurity to function. So all firms are now tech companies. So it no longer makes sense to make that distinction between real world company and tech company. Are internet users, is that a relevant term to use anymore? Because a lot of, it's a complication that internet users are no longer people. Many connected devices like, I'll continue with this energy sensor example that I've mentioned a few times. It doesn't really have a formal relationship to a human user, but neither is that the case in the screen-based internet anymore. Some people online are actually bots. We know that. These are programs that simulate human activity. And I'll just pause here for a moment to say that I have a Webster's dictionary from before the Civil War in the United States. And I occasionally look up words in that. And I looked up the word bot, not thinking it would be in there, but the word bot was actually in there, and it means worms in the intestines of a horse. So that's really not a bad definition. But in the world we live in right now, we can't always be assured that someone we're interacting with is an actual person. They may be just a program simulating human activity. So I could really say a lot about this complication of internet users. I would love to discuss that if people are interested. But also internet freedom. What is internet freedom? Free speech, content, access to knowledge, things related to the free flow of information in a free and open internet. These have been very, very important freedom concepts. And now the meaning of that changes a bit to make cybersecurity the great human rights issue of our time. The right to not be attacked, the right to not be harmed, the right to have privacy in this domain. A lot of the problems that I mentioned, very briefly, can all be solved with stronger cybersecurity. So that changes internet freedom. Do we want a free and open internet in areas that where data collection in combination with other data collection might bring harm to consumers? So it's a very, very interesting question in internet governance about the nature of interoperability, the nature of a free and open internet, the nature of who's an internet user, and then the nature of what's a tech company now, when everything is just blurred in ways that are very complicated. Now, this is really just to make you smile, but I had a pre-pandemic book tour and I had a post-pandemic book tour. So, it was very, very exciting traveling around, and then the pandemic hit, and you can see my trusty co-author in a book t-shirt there, who is under the desk right now. it really has been a journey, and it has really made me think about if I had asked that question that in the beginning of the book in a different way. Instead of asking what would the internet be doing if humans suddenly left the earth, what would we say? What would humans be doing if the internet suddenly left the earth? Because I have been able to stay in touch with elderly relatives. I've been able to run the School of Communication at American University. I've been able to have telemedicine appointments, get information about the virus. It really did make me think, being, having a pre-pandemic book tour and then the post-pandemic book tour, and everything that we're doing online right now. Shifting that question around is a very interesting one. So I want to just end with this slide and a final thought, coming back to the internet and everything. With all of the challenges of this environment, to privacy, to speech, to disinformation, to democracy, to consumer safety, to national security, and the critical infrastructure protection, what's the upside of the Internet of Things? Well, Robin knows this, and I know some other people on here, and you know that I'm an engineer, by training, practice, and in my heart, and I love technology. And I also have a disabled family member who is, able to stay in their home. A lot of you might have family members with Alzheimer's, and they have assistive technologies that help them to stay in their homes. Cyber embedded medical devices right now during the pandemic are bringing health benefits to millions of people. Wearable technologies are allowing so many things to happen for fitness and health. The IoT is already helping with conservation efforts, detecting leaks in pipelines. Autonomous vehicles are already improving productivity in the industrial settings in which they're used. So they're raising the concerns and calling, as I do in the book, for an all hands on deck action to address cyber physical safety, to address the national security around it. And privacy is not at all dystopian. It is exactly because the internet in everything and the innovations that go with that are so exciting and promising that we have to get this right. So if I may, I'll just read, as I've been enjoying doing when I discuss the book and when I have an opportunity to do this. I was hoping I could just read the very brief last paragraph and then an epilogue that I wrote after the book was done. The merging of cyberspace with the physical world is clearly here, even if this chapter is still in its infancy. Connected sensors and actuators are in everything, including the flesh. Being human and being digital are now physically intertwined. The internet has had many chapters. Its leap from the digital world to the physical world is an extraordinary one. And then I added an epilogue. When I saw this person, this young child in the picture that I hope you can see as well, and I'll read the quick epilogue. The week I completed this book, a 5-year-old boy received his first 3D printed prosthetic arm at a Home Depot in Annapolis, Maryland, not far from my home in Washington, D.C. A wonderful sales associate created the prosthetic arm on a Dremel 3D printer using blueprints he downloaded from an organization called Enabling the Future. It's a group of volunteers around the world who use their 3D printers to fabricate free artificial upper limbs for people in need. The smile on the boy's face is a reminder that building digital trust and security is ultimately about people. The cyber-physical nexus is a human space. Thank you so much for listening. Thank you for having me, and I very much look forward to your comments and questions.
Thank you, Laura. Thank you so much, Dr. DeNardis. That was really a wonderful and enlightening presentation. Let's pivot and go to some questions. We've got a number of questions that have come in, and if folks want to have any more, again, feel free to type them into the Q&A box there, and we're just going to go through them. Okay, so our first question is from Jessica Dickinson Goodman. And her question is, what policies do we need in place to make it so I can be sure my refrigerator won't become a part of a botnet that is used to undermine democracy around the world?
I think we know from the Mirai botnet that we aren't there yet, that it can be used as a botnet. I mean, so a lot of the devices in our homes are not upgradable, and it can be, if it's connected to a network in your home, it can be weaponized in that way. It has to, the standards have to be higher. The standards have to be higher, and they have to, in fact, it would be an interesting exercise. You know, it's not hard to create a DDoS attack. I think this crowd knows this. It's not a very hard thing to do. But if we had some kind of policies about making sure that devices are upgradable, and you had you know what's worked really well? It's a complete hassle, but having automatic updates to software has worked fairly well. It doesn't get us far enough. We still have problems with ransomware. We still have problems with 0-day vulnerabilities that are just not known, and there's an attack. But if there was that same kind of standard of upgradability and automatic updates, I think that would be very helpful. We're just not there yet.
Yeah, thanks so much for that. Our next question is from Michael Delson at Carnegie Endowment. And he says, Laura, great talk. For more than 15 years, we've been hearing about the networked home, and some digital pioneers tried to wire up their light bulbs, music systems, almost everything. But it wasn't easy because most home networking devices didn't talk to each other. Why did it take so long to get home networking standards right? What lessons can be learned and applies to other parts of the IoT?
Thank you so much, Michael. It's really great to get that question, and I wish we were sitting in a room having a cup of coffee right now, and hope to see you soon. I would say that the standards are not right yet, and you know it's a very interesting mess. The standards in homes. So yes, you can get a lot of. I wish we could do a show of hands, but does anyone have connected light bulbs in their homes? It's pretty easy to buy devices like that. It's pretty easy to have a home alarm system, but it turns out to be an area where it's difficult to have competition, because there's a resurgence of proprietary standards. There is a surge and a rise of standards that come from companies that have not been involved in internet standard setting in the same way that born digital tech companies have been. And right now, it's not very clear how there'll be more interoperability. So whereas you may, as I said before, you may not want your toaster to talk to a nuclear reactor, you do want your toaster to talk to your network and to connect to other kitchen appliances potentially. And there really needs to be more interoperability in that area. So I think part of the reason it's taken so long, has it taken so long? I'm not sure. Think about when it's really not that long ago when the first interface messaging processors sent packets over ARPANET, right? Is that about just a little over 50 years ago? If you think about the long arc of technology, going from those packets sent between four locations in the United States to having connected insulin pumps so that the doctor can monitor how you're doing and your treatment of diabetes. To me, that's really fast. On the other hand, if you think about what was happening historically at the time in 1968, right? Well, Martin Luther King Jr. Was assassinated around that time. It was before Roe v. Wade in the U.S. There was the Stonewall uprising in the United States. Think about the history. There was a lot happening. When you think about that, it seems like a long time ago. But if you think about the arc of 50 years in the long trajectory of technology, I think we've gotten into the internet and everything very, very quickly. The April Fool's jokes in the internet request for comments. I think there's one that was just a total joke. Read the April Fools, the April 1st RFCs over time. The Internet Engineering Task Force it has a great sense of humor. But there was one a while ago that was about it was hypertext coffee pot transmission protocol or something like that. And, it was a joke, but at that time, no one ever thought that a coffee pot would be connected. Or if they did, I didn't know about it. And someone was probably anticipating that. I certainly didn't. And it's happened pretty quickly.
Thank you. Okay, our next question. Who is currently working on children and youth's right to privacy against tracking from IoT systems, given how many companies are selling child tracking devices, both wearable and online?
Well, that is an area that is really understood well. Policymakers who are technically savvy in the IoT arena immediately get that. But I think some of the advocacy groups, like especially from the standpoint of privacy, are doing work in this area, advocating for certain standards. And there are scholars. There's one in California right now, Catherine Montgomery. There are privacy scholars that have been doing a lot of work around children's safety. It's not an area that I specialize in, but I know that there are a lot of people who are very concerned about that. And you don't really think about the technology that is all around you until you hear about a horrible situation. Was it about 5 years? How long ago was it? Just a few years ago, when some parents came into their child's room and a hacker was screaming at the baby through the baby monitor. When you hear about a story like that is so horrifying, and when you think about I have a stuffed animal that had I could go get in the other room, the one that had that hackers were able to get into. It's the little teddy bear where you squeezed its hand, you could leave a message, and it talk to your child if you were traveling over the internet and talk through the teddy bear. And it was very easy to hack at one point. I mean, there were some very interesting panels at the Internet Governance Forum last time around, and groups that do child safety around internet governance that are involved in this as well. It's a huge area of concern.
Great, thank you. Our next question is from Patrick Neurager. Dr. DeNardis, how do you foresee the future of blockchain technology developing?
Well, blockchain technology has a lot of applications in internet governance. We think about it so closely associated with cryptocurrency, which makes sense because it's the basis for the thousands of different Bitcoin is just one, right? It's the basis for how a lot of cryptocurrencies work, but it also has a lot of applications in transformational technologies around identity infrastructure. And that's an area, the building of trust in the infrastructure of the internet is an important goal, especially when you think about the heightened social consequences. So it's definitely a tool. It's one technological approach that should be embraced in all aspects of internet governance. But on the other hand, I think there's a tremendous amount of hype, and you hear absolutely crazy things like an alternative internet that's based on blockchain that just fundamentally doesn't understand what blockchain does. So I think as with everything else, it's not a homogenizing technology. The question is, where can blockchain be applied in a way that solves a specific problem? And I think that there are a lot of areas around trust and identity where it can be applied.
Thank you. Our next question is from Esther Nogam, and she says she's the president of ISOC Cameroon chapter. Welcome. She says, first of all, thank you for this very interesting webinar. Thanks to Mrs. DeNardis for the points she raised. As president of chapter and lawyer involved in some research starting in my area, all the challenges you raised are so important. And here we have more and more Internet of Things and users, as well as policymakers, don't even know they are actually using those objects. And what are the issues and challenges they raised linked to privacy, data collection and circulation, security, sensitive infrastructures, democracy, freedom, and especially freedom of speech, even in terms of Internet governance? The African Union has started questioning Internet of Things, but these things are moving so fast, and the states are not addressing those questions. I'm wondering if you have some links, research papers that you can recommend, and if you will accept to contribute to policy and business briefs I am preparing on this topic and others.
So this is Esther.
Yes.
Esther, yeah, thanks, Esther. It's really nice to have you here. Thank you for joining the event. And if you just shoot me an email, and you can find me pretty easily online, my email address is just DeNardis@american.edu. You can Google my name, and I will send you. Why don't you allow me, if I may, to just send you a digital copy of the book? And if there's anything in there that would be helpful, then please, by all means, use it. But I'm glad that you're working on that problem there. And the U.S. has many of the same problems, and so just send me an email, and I'll be happy to send you what I can. But what is very interesting? We stop thinking about technology as technology. We have a moment of opportunity to address this, because we stop thinking about technology as technology at some point. I always like to use the example of the kitchen sink. There's something called the Carousel of Progress at Disney World, where you can see the family that moves from one generation to another, and that the changing patterns of technology. And it's a very big deal when they bring the pump that was outside the house, the water pump, inside of the kitchen, and it looks just like the outside pump. They thought about it as technology. How many of you think about the kitchen sink as technology now? Right? We stop seeing it as technology, although now we do see it as technology again, if it has the cyber embedded aspects to it, and you need batteries, and it's digitized and connected to Bluetooth or your Wi-Fi network. But that kind of transformation means that the internet is going into the material world. It's already in the material world, and we in some cases can't see it. But even when we can see it, we stop thinking about it as technology. So it's very important to be raising the issues about consumer safety and privacy now, and also national security, while it still is at that moment of being a technology policy issue, and not just kind of descending into every other area of policy.
All right, thank you. Our next question is from Sarah Ang. She says, "Hi, Dr. Laura. I have two questions. Both are regarding the ubiquity of the internet and regulation. The first is connected to the politics of platforms that allows companies to negate responsibility. Because of the ubiquity of the internet and the Internet of Things in everyday life, I have noticed that it is hard to create policies that protect individuals. I was wondering, how do we think about robust privacy policies for better governance? I was also wondering how informed consent would work with Internet of Things. One thing that is complicated with security and privacy in IoT is the ability to opt out of data collection. How do we balance security and privacy versus openness and transparency?"
Thank you very much for that question. There's a lot there. We're not, in some ways, we're not even at the question of balancing openness with privacy, because we have neither openness nor privacy in the Internet of Things. If we had greater openness, we would have more privacy. For example, just having disclosures about data breaches. The European Union's GDPR goes, makes a lot of progress in that area, but the extent to which that applies to the Internet of Things is sometimes in question. I think it shouldn't be, but it sometimes is in question. But do you feel like you have a right to know if data collected about you through the IoT, if there's been some kind of a data breach? I think that we should know whether there's been a data breach. I think there should be disclosures about vulnerabilities and, a general amount of openness in that area. Now, you made an interesting connection also to platform politics and what platform companies are doing around privacy. So that is an interesting, in a way, dividing line, because we now, we have surveillance capitalism, as it's called, and we've made a Faustian bargain as a society where we use social media, we use email, we use search engines, we use a lot of software for free. And yet, if you look at, I mentioned the stock prices of like Google, Apple, Facebook, Microsoft today. Well, we're not paying those companies, at least Google in some cases, or Facebook. We are paying them with what Jack Balkin calls Soylent Green. If you know that science fiction, we are the payment, we are the data. So that is the basic business model upon which everything in the social media world works, and around the communication software. But how can we unring that bell? I think it's going to be very, very hard to unring that bell, because the entire business model, the entire system is based on the collection of personal data about us, and then serving us online ads and selling that data for various reasons. But that's not happening to the same extent in the Internet of Things. So now is a great moment to make sure that that doesn't happen, and have restrictions on how data is shared. I mentioned that the collection of data is endemic to the very system. There's a constant feedback loop, but it shouldn't be a given that that is then used to serve ads to me. And I think that there's just a very small moment of time to stop those kinds of things from happening, so that we don't have the same kind of privacy invasive situation in online ad serving and the IoT that we do in platforms.
Great, thank you so much. I think that's all of the time that we've got for questions today, but thank you all for those wonderful questions, and for attending. And especially a huge thanks to Dr. Laura DeNardis for coming and sharing her research and scholarship with us. And I think that, we're all a little bit better off for it. So thank you very much. And I also want to give a quick update about next month's webinar. Let me just put on my screen here. Oh, didn't load. There we go. Let's see. We're going to have our next webinar will be a month from today, 4 weeks from today, the 3rd of May, also at 3 p.m. And for some reason, it's not loading my screen. Sorry about this, guys. Here we go. Let's try now. Hopefully you can see it. Okay, there we go. Sorry about that. Again, next month, our tech policy webinar will be May 3rd, and our speaker is Dr. Mark Nitzberg. The topic is artificial intelligence, humanity and governance in a world of thinking machines. Dr. Nitzberg is the executive director at UC Berkeley Center for Human Compatible AI. He also is the head of strategic outreach at Berkeley's AI Research Lab, and the director of technology research at BRI, which is the Berkeley Roundtable on the International Economy. He's also written a number of books on artificial intelligence, and so he will be taking some time out of his day next month to come talk with us about his work in artificial intelligence and some of the work that the Berkeley Center is doing on these topics. So I hope you all will consider coming back next month, and thank you for attending, and consider joining the San Francisco Bay Area Internet Society chapter. And with that, I will bring this to a close. Thank you, Dr. Laura DeNardis, and to all of our attendees for coming today. Have a good afternoon.
Thank you so much.